Hey chess fans, we are going to continue learning about tactics, some basic tactics. If you've watched some previous videos, you've probably learned a little bit about forks and about pins. I think the last video we did, we covered pins and the Stafford Gambit. Now the really cool thing about tactics is they kind of give your opponent no good option. That's the point, is to take away their choices. So when you fork them, they have no choice but to give up a piece. When you pin them, that immobilizes a piece and makes it where it's not really part of the game anymore. It can't do its job, it can't cover squares anymore, and so it just takes a piece out of the game. Now what we're going to talk about in this one is when you force a piece to move. So like with pins, we immobilized it. With this one, you're going to make a piece move. And we're going to look at two different tactics that involve making pieces move. One is very, very like the pin. It's called the skewer, where the more important piece is in front instead of behind. And the other one we're going to talk about is a distraction, where you have you force your opponent to move a piece that was guarding something else. So it's also called removing the defender, is another term for that. So let's take a look at this position on the screen here. Now, it's white's turn to move, and if you'll notice, white has to go 1, 2, 3, 4 squares to promote, where black only has to go 1, 1, 2, 3. So it looks like black is doing pretty well here, right? Don't want to move that. So it looks like black is doing pretty well here. He's going to queen first, but who's actually winning? Well, let's find out. So white moves, black, white, and black gets the queen. Oh no, so black has gotten a huge advantage, right? But here is where the skewer comes in. Take a look at this. When white promotes, the king is in check, and when the king moves, the queen is attacking the queen behind the king. This is a skewer because the king, the more valuable piece, has to move. In this case, it doesn't even have an option. The king has to move, and when the king does, then white is able to gobble up the black queen, capture that one. All right, so let's take a look at another example. This is a really important one to understand, especially if you get into a position where you are trying to get your pawn promoted. Look at this. White is just about to promote the pawn to a queen, but can't quite make it because the black rook is sitting there waiting to take the pawn. The moment the white rook leaves, the black rook is able to take that pawn. So what happens if white swings the rook way over to the other side? Well, that looks like a mistake, right? Black can just take the pawn. But do you see the skewer coming up? Boom. White rook attacks the king, puts the king in check, and when the king moves out of the way, the rook will gobble up the other rook. Boom. All right, so big advantage for white there. Hopefully you know your king and rook in game and how to slowly force that king closer and closer to a wall, and you can win that game. All right, let's take a look at this one. See if you can find the skewer in this position. All right, why don't you pause the video, take a couple of seconds, see if you can find the skewer in this position. All right. Okay, did you pause the video? Did you find it, or did you cheat? Are you looking ahead? Don't cheat. All right, did you find it? It's a really good one. It's white to move, and boom. This bishop, which is protected by the rook, right, is attacking the queen, and if the queen moves, the bishop takes the rook. So even if the queen moves to protect the rook, it's still, if you know your piece values, rook's worth 5, bishop's worth 3. Always going to be a good trade if you get more than you gave. So that is the skewer, right? This forces a piece to move so that you can get another piece behind it, unlike the pin where you force the piece to stay put. Okay, so let's look at the other tactic, the removing the defender, right? So this is a position that happened back in 2017. At the time, the number 1 and 2 players were Magnus Carlsen and Wesley So, and that's who's playing. Magnus Carlsen had the black pieces and Wesley So had the white pieces. And it was a faster game, and so Wesley So made a mistake. Wesley So is thinking, if I can just trade these queens, and several had actually made a couple of moves trying to get these queens traded. Wesley So thought he could hang on to this position. And so Wesley So made the choice to move the queen up. Okay, looks like, okay, black can now take the queen, the white king takes the queen, it's an even trade. But black queen is attacking the white queen, and the only piece defending the white queen is the black king. So if we can get that king to move and stop defending the queen, then black wins the queen. And that's exactly what Carlsen did. Carlsen played rook to h1 check. The king only has 2 legal moves. The king can come here to g2, after which the queen would take the queen, or the king could capture the rook and the queen still takes the queen. So that's what Wesley So, I think actually Wesley So resigned at this position because he knew that no matter what, he was going to lose the queen and was not going to be able to come back from this point in the game. This is too devastating. The queen's right up against the king. There's nowhere for that king to go. So that is removing the defender. So let's take a look at another example. Let's see if you can find the sequence that forces white to give up the queen. All right. So the idea here with all the taxes is look for forcing moves, and nothing is more forcing than checks. So why don't you pause the video, see if you can find the forcing line that costs white the queen. All right. You paused, right? You're not cheating. You paused? Okay. Let's take a look. Hopefully you saw that there's really only a few ways you can put the king in check. The queen can go right here. That looks good, right? No. If the queen goes there, then boom. That's not going to be any good. All right, so maybe the queen could go here. Well, you could do that, but that white can pretty easily defend by just bringing the rook up or something like that. And then white's still threatening some pretty dangerous stuff on the back rank, especially once you get something like rook to g8 in and queen up as well. So that's probably not going to be the check you want to use. Instead, I hope you found rook to h5. Right now, the king has no legal moves. Notice the queen, the black queen, is preventing the king from stepping up, and the black rook is preventing the king from stepping back, and his own piece is blocking him from stepping to the side. So if you know about check, you know the only ways out are for CPR. Capture the attacker, can't do it. R was run away, which we can't do that, so you have to protect. And so white has to play the queen over. So again, at this point, black could just trade queens here. But if black traded queens, white's looking pretty good. White's going to be able to come up here and take these pawns out pretty fast with the rook. So black needs to find a better way to proceed. The only defender of the queen is the king. So if black can draw that king away, that means black wins the queen. Hopefully you see it, rook to h2. The king has to capture the rook. There's not even another option. The king has to capture the rook. Black capture the queen, and now it's a whole lot easier for black to finish this game and win with the passed pawn on the outside and the queen against the rook. Should be looking pretty good for black. Okay, one more example. This ties into some of the stuff we looked at last week, last video. Last video, we looked at pins in the Stafford Gambit. Well, there is actually a sequence in the Stafford Gambit that gives you an opportunity to do a skewer or a remove the defender. All right. No matter what they do, one of these is going to happen if they play what looks like natural moves, things that you would expect to happen. Okay, so remember the Stafford Gambit starts out with the e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, and then knight captures on e5. And the Stafford Gambit starts when black chooses to gambit that pawn away rather than chasing the knight away and gathering the e-pawn himself, plays knight to c6, offering a knight trade. When white accepts it, black now has the open lines for the bishop, which are nice, but he is down a pawn. Okay, so one thing that white might do is try to attack the knight. Now that's not a great idea, it's okay. If white attacks the knight can jump forward. Again, not a great move, but it baits white into a trap. If you were in this position, what would you play? All right? Your black's knight is now in your territory. What are you going to do about that? All right? If you have studied with me a while, you know that things like bishop to d3 ends up blocking the pawn, which blocks the bishop, right? And so we generally don't put a bishop in front on d3. So you probably don't want to use the bishop, but how are you going to drive that knight off? Okay? A really natural seeming move that opens the line for your bishop, looks like it's good development, is to attack the knight with the d-pawn. But that right there is a huge mistake. All right, we're going to see why. Let's pretend like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just going to hang my knight. And we play bishop to c5. Looks like the knight is hanging. All right, so now you've lost a pawn. You've lost a knight. Why is this so good for black? Well, look, we have got the queens pointed at each other. And the only defender of the queen is the king, right? So if I can get that king to move, I win the queen. So hopefully you see bishop takes on f2. The king is in check. The king cannot step to d2 because of the queen. So the king has two choices. The king can step up to e2 or come over and take the bishop. If you take the bishop, though, you lose the queen right off the bat. The only other option is king to e2, after which you get a skewer, right? And now you have to take the queen, or sorry, you have to take the bishop, and the queen comes in, and you lose the queen. So this is really neat because we had both a skewer or a remove the defender in the same opening of the Stafford Gambit. So hopefully you are getting a good grasp on pins, skewers, removing defenders, forks, all these tactics, because here's what happens. When you learn these tactics, when you're playing the game, your opponent feels like you're playing both sides. Now, I've been in those games before where I felt like my opponent was making my moves for me, and that's not a fun game to play unless you're the one making the moves for the opponent, right? And so that's what these tactics do. Immobilizing pieces so they can't move, forcing them to move so you can take other things, forking them and so they have to give up pieces. These tactics are how you win games. So find ways to practice these and see if you can spot them in your games. And good luck. I'll see you next time.